Today I want to talk about M1. I am surrounded by a plethora of M1 Apple Silicon products that have come out over the past year and a half. And with the recent announcements at WWDC, specifically about new M2 products and the second generation of Apple Silicon, I want to dive into what remains. The products that are still out there, some of which have not yet been replaced, and get to the bottom of whether you should still be buying M1 products with M2 coming out, what the best value options are, and what those of you who have an M1 device and are thinking of upgrading should know about. So as usual, make sure to get subscribed and leave a like down below, and let's get started with today's video. Today's video is sponsored by Squarespace, the all-in-one platform to build a beautiful online presence and run your business. All right, so first of all, holy cow. This isn't even all of the M1 devices out there. I'm missing the iPad Pro 11-inch and the iPad Air, and I don't have an M1 MacBook Air. So there are a ton of M1 devices out there, and now, as of WWDC 2022, we are starting to see the second iteration of Apple Silicon, the M2 generation. Now, I do want to stress that this is all very early stages, and obviously we don't have performance metrics or full actual reviews with hands-on access to the M2 products. That's going to come next month. So for now, what we're stuck with is taking Apple's recommendations and taking their statistics at face value. Now, I don't particularly think that Apple has an incentive to lie, and in my video where I dived into the M2, we sort of went through their analyses and seemed like things mostly checked out. You can check that video out over there. Now, that being said, I think there is a very common misconception in the tech world that when you have the newest, shiniest, brightest thing, the thing that they compare it to, the previous generation, often seems to pale. The M1 chip, which wowed people when it came out, has now been out for about 18 months, and now it has a replacement with, shiny graphs, and the M1 showed up as a gray bar, the M2 showed up as a colorful bar, so that means it's gotta be better, right? But if you take a step back and you actually examine the products currently available, I think what you would find is that there's not necessarily anything majorly deficient in all of these devices, with maybe one exception. Now, I'm not gonna beat around the bush. I'm just gonna come right out and say it. I think one of the most important upgrades to the M2 chip is not 18% better multi-core CPU performance. It's not 35% better GPU performance, although that one is pretty nice. I think the biggest thing that is going to make a huge difference is adding the ProRes decoders. That is going to have a profound effect on anyone who works with photo and video on these devices. And having used the M1 MacBook Pro from launch day until the M1 Pros came out, so about a year, having used the M1 iMac in the base configuration that's down a GPU core and a fan to edit several videos back when this thing came out, I can safely say that the biggest thing holding back these devices from being full-on professional level devices. And so when you talk about adding that to the M2 chip, you are really going to be closing the gap between the base $1,000-ish M1 devices and the $2,000-ish M1 Pro devices. Now, when M2 Pro and M2 Max come out, we'll see what that does to change up the scenario. But for right now, I think M2 presents an incredible potential for a lot of people to get into video editing without having to spend $2,000 on the 14-inch MacBook Pro or a Mac Studio. Whoa, hey, that reminds me. With today's sponsor, Squarespace, you can use your M1 Mac to build a beautiful website. Look, guys, they just have the best tools and templates, and they make things so easy. Getting started with my awesome website took just a few clicks. You can preview templates, and they don't make you sign up with 800 different credentials. Look, they have sign in with Apple. It's great. It takes like 2 seconds. Plus, with their SEO tools, you can perfectly target a website toward the untapped market of 15-inch MacBook Air customers. We all want it. let's make it happen by building a website with Squarespace. Head over to squarespace.com/LukeMiani to save 10% off your first purchase of a website domain. And now let's get back to the video. I think the product that I'm probably most excited for is going to be the M2 Mac Mini, because that is going to have, all of the cooling that the M2 chip could ever need and more, and therefore will be able to unlock as much performance as it can give, and I think that's going to be a really, really killer device. However, you might notice that I'm talking about video editing, and I'm biased, right? Because that applies to me. I am a video editor. If you're buying these things for general computing tasks or for Blender 3D rendering, there's a lot of use cases where that encode and decode engine is not really going to make all that much of a difference. And so it does beg the question, is M2 worth the hype for a lot of people? Well, I'd like to direct our attention at first here to the MacBook Pro, because the MacBook Pro is a phenomenal product that has always been a bit unnecessary. Like, this is a very good laptop, but for $300 more than a MacBook Air, you got 8 to 10% better performance thanks to active cooling, and apart from that, it really wasn't worth buying. And now that they, again, have not changed this design, and so it's still $1,300 with an M2 chip. What the heck is that? I'm obviously going to be buying it and reviewing it, and we'll see what the performance difference looks like, but I can already tell you that that is not something that's going to be worth buying. However, what we are now faced with is the residual M1 devices. The MacBook Air and the MacBook Pro with the M1 chip are coming down in price quite a bit, even when still buying them new from sites like Apple Refurbished or Best Buy or B&H. And that presents a pretty interesting opportunity, because the new M2 chips are not going to be widely available, much less discounted, for quite a while. I think it's pretty clear that there is a very good reason that Apple only introduced the MacBook Air and the MacBook Pro with the M2 chip, and the fact that they're waiting a month to even launch them. The M2 chips are gonna be scarce for quite a while, but these guys, the older devices, they are already heavily discounted. I made a video not that long ago talking about this very Mac Mini, in fact, that I paid $589 for. That is an outrageously good deal. And you're talking about saving $130 over an M2 Mac Mini that doesn't even exist yet. Same thing goes for the iMac. I made a video about this not too long ago, where you can get these things, the base model like I have, for $1,000 on Amazon. $1,000. That is a ridiculously good deal. You're getting a 4.5K display, mouse and keyboard. It's fun, it's pretty, it's, super light, and you can get it for $1,000. What more could you possibly want? Now, I do want to take some time and talk about what you should do if you already have an M1 device and you're thinking of upgrading. Well, I think this is where we're gonna have to get a little bit conspiratorial. Now, I should disclaim that I always believe, and most other tech YouTubers will tell you this, that you should buy now what you need now. So if you do have any of these devices, with the exception of probably the iPad Pro, because nobody is ever thinking about upgrading their iPad Pro. In fact, I'm just gonna get rid of this thing. But if you have one of the rest of them, then you might be wondering, when's the perfect time? Well, I think we are in a pretty interesting situation, because the M2 chip is largely the same as the M1. There's more GPU cores, there's slightly faster GPU cores, there's slightly faster CPU cores. What exactly does that net you? Honestly, apart from, as I mentioned, those encoders and decoders, not that much. So I don't necessarily think that the M2 generation chip is gonna be enough to tempt most people from ditching their M1 stuff. So if you do have one of these devices, I think your best bet is gonna be waiting for M3. We've had a bunch of recent news about TSMC's next generation node, and I think that is the process that's going to yield pretty significant gains to Apple Silicon. When they got on stage and they said, second generation 5nm chip, to me, that's a signal that this is not a revolutionary difference. And Apple wasn't really claiming that it was. They were saying, look at this, 18% performance gains, 35% for the GPU, adding some little niceties and additional memory, all great upgrades, but not game changing. And I think that's intentional. Because, I mean, there's only so much you can do when you're working with the same process. Why bother re-architecting the entire chip when in about 12 months, there's a whole new process for you to play with? Now, that being said, I am very excited for M2, and I'm really excited specifically for the new MacBook Air, because I think that is going to be an absolutely phenomenal and very compelling product. Now, if you are worried about the pricing of the new M2 MacBook Air, I wouldn't worry too much, because if you remember back in 2018, when the MacBook Air got the redesign that it currently has, that launched at $1199. When that got updated in 2019, it came down to $1099, and then in 2020, that came down to $999. So the current generation MacBook Air, yes, it's more expensive right now, but give it about 2 years, and this new design with probably an M3 chip, as I mentioned, a good upgrade, is probably gonna be $1099 or eventually back down to $999. Let's see how the M2 chip is going. Let's see what that does to M1 device prices, and then I think we'll be able to make really informed decisions. But as I mentioned, you're kind of in a win-win situation right now. So let me know what you think about this whole discussion in the comments below. As usual, thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm gonna go iMac.